beautiful people. Welcome to Different Angles. It's all about perspective. And I'm Avra.
And my name is Yuko, and we are here to share different perspectives about trauma as well as anxiety today. Please do take note that we do not give any medical advice or diagnosis. Our discussions in this conversation are based on our own thoughts and purely based on our own perspectives, learning as well as educational backgrounds.
Absolutely. And when I'm thinking about the word trauma, Yuko, I'm wondering, what does trauma really mean? And I, like you, also like the dictionary. So I looked it up. And it comes from a Greek word meaning wound. A wound as in a deep gash, something that you've hurt.
Oh, okay. So like when somebody stabs you, that wound, right?
Correct. Except this is not necessarily a physical wound. This is an emotional or psychological wound. So trauma is a response to an event or an incident that can cause physical, emotional, spiritual, physiological, really big harm, and it makes you become dysfunctional so that you are not able to have any ordinary kind of life, and it overwhelms your ability to cope.
Well, I'm not surprised, with this ever-changing world that we're living in, especially right now, in COVID times itself, a lot of people are going through changes, and lots of changes can cause trauma too. So in the need to address mental health, this is becoming a serious need for the generation of today. So let's take a look at some, practical options and better understanding to how can we manage this trauma and anxiety better. With regards to trauma, Avra, you mentioned the definition of trauma. So I like to understanding in terms of what kind of trauma do we have? What types of trauma do we have? And so there are three different types of trauma that I found also. So number one is acute trauma. Now, acute trauma is caused by one single accident that happened in your life, and it can last up to 4 weeks. So it could be a sequence of events that happened, in a short period of time. It could be nightmares, itself, and it could cause you to have dissociation, which we probably will talk about later on. Now, the second trauma is chronic trauma, which this refers to repeated and prolonged period of experiencing that feeling itself. So, for example, if you undergo abuse or if someone undergoes domestic violence itself for a period of more than 4 weeks, or it may be they experience some kind of dysfunction in their professional or social areas. This could cause chronic trauma. Now, the third form of trauma would be the most complicated form, and that's complex trauma. So what are complex trauma? Like the word complex, it says, right? You're exposed to multiple areas of traumatic events. So this can be invasive. It can cause it can be something that happens within your interpersonal events, or you could have it can happen because you have multiple incidents of different kinds that happen to you that cause this complex trauma. So many different types of trauma that we have. There are also many different causes of trauma. So not just understanding what are the different types of trauma, we need to know how that they cause, It could be, from like we mentioned just now, it could be physical, it could be sexual, emotional abuse, it could be caused from childhood experiences. I know a lot of people that have experienced different kind of traumatic events when they were a kid, and they cannot shake it off as they grow older. That could be possibly domestic violence that they've also observed from home, or bullying in schools that they experienced as a kid or, in their growing years. Well, there's another cause of trauma that could be natural disasters, especially from countries that experience a lot of earthquakes, a lot of natural disasters that are not within their own control. Or it could be caused by accidents in life. For example, car accidents, right? And anyone that goes through a car accident could definitely be left with a traumatic sense of pain, that sudden shock that happened to them. That could be the third form, the third cause of trauma, and that would be going through a medical procedure. That could actually cause a very huge blow to one's self-esteem or self-confidence because of the medical procedures that they had to go through, and in embracing the level of danger, near-death danger that I actually face. So when it comes to death also, death of a loved one could cause trauma because it's a experience, it's a change that you experience that could never be reversed. And then, of course, we have trauma that's caused from change in your current status of life, for example, divorce, or your loss of your parents, or maybe you are moving a location. That could also cause a trauma. In fact, if you actually move from, for example, one place that you're staying in for most of your life, maybe you've shifted your residential status, from staying overseas to coming back home, that could cause a bit of trauma too
Sure.
because of the huge amount of change.
But I also think within the context that you're speaking, and we're discussing now some of the reasons why we have trauma and what happens to you when you have trauma. I think understanding your body's response to trauma is so important. Because, as you know, part of my theory is that we have a mind-body connection. So what is actually happening and what's happening in your brain? Because you can go to the doctor with a physical ailment, and the doctor will, for example, when you've got tonsillitis, open your mouth and he'll have a look and he'll say, okay, you've got tonsillitis. And tonsillitis gives you X, Y, Z. It's caused through A, B, C. This is the things you need to do for it. And he will give you a reasonable in-depth information map of what's going on with your tonsillitis. And then he will give you some medication to cure it. When you go to your doctor and you tell him your symptoms of trauma, he will tell you, you're suffering from trauma and you have anxiety disorder. Oh, great. Now you have something to be anxious about. You have something to be anxious about because you've been labeled as having anxiety disorder or that you have trauma.
Okay.
Does he explain to you what's going on in your head, what's happening in your body, what's happening in your brain? Your average GP, and I'm not criticizing here, this is something that I have found evidential in my own experience. I had thyroid issues and it was causing me so many side effects. Nobody ever explained to me what was going on in my body. So I didn't understand why I had brain fog and why I was feeling anxious and why I was feeling traumatized. So what was actually happening in my body was happening in my brain too. Our nervous system sends us messages to the brain and it gives it various instructions to perform and reactions. So you've got a sympathetic nervous system and that activates what we call a flight response mode. And what happens when you're in that state is that your blood pressure goes sky high and your digestion and your reproductive system almost stops working when you're in a panic situation. Then you've got your parasympathetic nervous system and that deactivates the response mode and then you become totally paralyzed or freeze. You can't move. And then your blood pressure and your heart rate decreases and the digestion and the reproductive area will start to increase. So the role of the nervous system is to allow you resources to cope with the trauma. So that your nervous system says, okay, hold on a minute, this person is in shock, and you start shaking and you stop and you can't do anything. And it's protecting you from stepping out of that vehicle should you have had a car accident and hurting yourself further because you're not aware of what your injuries are because all your brain and nervous system is telling you is you in shock. So it just cuts off any physical reaction. Or you could do the opposite. You could jump out that car and run. So that's what our nervous system is in place there for, really to protect us. Not necessarily always for the right reason or the right response, but it has a job to do. And when it doesn't know what to do, we end up having shock and we end up having flight and fright and fawn. So you can explain, because I know you know this quite well, the different reactions that we have with fight and flight responses.
That's right. So with regards to the trauma responses, to better explain it, let me show you a little diagram, okay? So this diagram right here explains the various type of trauma responses that you can see. When a person experiences trauma, like what Avra you mentioned, you either fight, you freeze, or there's one more, you call fawn. So in terms of flight, basically you're somebody that takes off, right? You overthink, you have anxiety, you just want to move, you just want to get out of that situation. That's why you cannot sit still. Now, when you want to fight, when you are somebody that fights as a trauma responder, you outburst in anger. So whenever you experience trauma, you burst. You start having, the tendency to control. You wanna be the bully in the situation, so that you have a sense of authority over the situation. Now, if you are somebody that freezes, right? That's one of the things that I personally struggle with. You actually get stuck on the spot. You find it really hard to make decisions because you're just completely numb in that spot itself. You find it so hard to actually, make any other decisions or to respond to anything else because you're just stuck in that moment. You're like an ice popsicle. You have frozen. And then the last portion is fawn, where you choose to please the person, whatever it takes, so that you don't feel that trauma response. So there's no boundaries for you at all. Whatever the person wants, you do it. So that's actually the 4 different trauma response that we can see.
Absolutely. So I think that gives us a pretty overall idea of exactly what the different areas are. And the area that I find most interesting of these is the last one that's not often brought to our attention, and that is fawn. Fawn is our normal daily behavior and the way that we try and navigate our trauma without it being too obvious. If someone is having a panic attack, or they're having a nervous feeling, or they are crying, they're having an emotion, you can see that very easily from a physical point of view. And you can identify flight, fight, and freeze. But fawn is not always identified, because what we do is, even though we can have overwhelm with it, we can also have codependency, as you mentioned, various areas in this. And those are hidden traits. Those are resources that come from within that we use in order to cope.
Exactly. So there are a lot of different responses that one actually chooses depending on what you have been exposed to or what you're used to, you see?
Yes.
But how about scientifically then? How do our brain actually responds during trauma response?
Well, I think it would be easier for us to explain that, Yuko, if you would put up my little diagram of this very pretty brain that's multicolored.
There you go.
There we go. So I'm not in favor of too much scientific information because I'm such a practical person, but we cannot ignore some of the scientific basis of what causes trauma and what actually happens. So in this very, very basic picture that you see on your screen now, we have the physiological responses to perceived danger. And they're designed to help us when we're in danger. Our brain releases some hormones. And the biggest hormone that we really, the 2 of them that we really have coming out in these particular traumatic stages is cortisol and adrenaline. And that gives us extra strength and extra energy to resist the fight or paralyzed freeze state of behavior, so that we can protect ourselves from all those fawn responses that I was discussing earlier. So all the areas in this diagram can be affected, not necessarily only one of them, all of them. So when we're in trauma, we have 0 cognitive functioning, and we feel like we're actually going crazy.
Wow.
In the limbic system, we have 3 main functions of the brain that are affected during trauma, and they are emotional. They have functions, the physical pain and the mind connection. So when we come to physical pain and the mind connection, what happens in the brain when we are experiencing trauma? So for example, and especially in children, you will have a child say, I don't want to go to school today because my tummy's sore. And some parents will just sort of in their heads think, oh, okay, she doesn't want to go to school, so she's pretending to have a sore tummy. There's no pretense. This is real pain. The child or person or victim or person suffering from trauma really does have a sore tummy. Because what's really happening is the brain is saying there's a problem and it needs to find a place to go to share this problem. So the prefrontal cortex, which is in the front of the brain, over here, this blue area, is the analytical decision making and stops during trauma. And what happens is it's regulated by the amygdala activity. And that is this tiny little red, okay? And then what happens is that starts activating some sort of behavior and or memory. Then we have an area that is this from the same area here in the amygdala that it gives you, regulates your behavior, it irritates your response to fear, it's emotional, it's all about your memories, and this gives you emotional responses. Then we move on and we have the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is the memory consolidation process that deregulates and underfires. So when we go into this panic and trauma state, these functions that are normally supposed to happen from these areas will stop working. So we go right to the bottom here, and this is the brainstem, this purple area at the bottom. And that is activated, what we call survival state. It's response and sensory information that shuts down. So the brain in the nervous area, the center, and that is your center that's responsible for your sleep patterns. Why can't you sleep when you're anxious and in trauma? That controls your body. You might get hot and sweaty and really hot flushed cheeks when you're uptight. You could have a sore tummy or indigestion. You could have trouble swallowing or trouble breathing. That part of your brainstem is what is responsible for that. So I think it's really good that you can understand really what happens in your brain and why these things happen, and that you understand that people that have physical pain when they are in trauma, it is real pain. It's not pretend pain. So you've got hyperarousal, which is your fight flight, which is what you taught us about just now. And that's a message from the brain to the nervous system. So that will give you your fear, your panic attacks, your tight muscles, your anxiety, your frustration, anger outbursts, overwhelm, hypersensitivity. So there's also the opposite of that, and what we were talking about just now, which is the freeze, okay? And that is depression, dissociation, numbness, emptiness, total burnout, and you actually struggle to articulate and even speak. It's a total detachment. When this happens, hormones are released. And they're chemicals that are produced by different glands across your body. So they travel through the bloodstream, acting as messengers and playing part of the body process. And that helps regulate your moods. So now I'm sure all of you have heard of some of these feel-good hormones, like endorphins, which is your pain reliever. Oxytocin, which is your love hormone involved in love, sex, childbirth, and bonding and empathy. You've got dopamine, which is your neurotransmitter associated to pleasurable sensations. When someone gives you a hug, how nice you feel, which has been so difficult over COVID. Your memory and your motor system is also enhanced by dopamine. And then, of course, you've got serotonin, and that regulates moods and your sleep and your appetite and your digestive and your memory. So it all ties in, and that's why I wanted to explain exactly what happens in your body, because I think it is important for us to understand this.
Wow, that is a lot of information to really digest right there. You mentioned about hyperarousal, as well as the differences between how you actually react in all the trauma response. There's actually something that somebody reminded me before, that there's a difference between our trauma responses, the anxiety, as well as the stress that we actually undergo.
Because
Avra, do you know what is the difference?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is where there's a lot of disparity, Yuka, because people tend to just bunch it all into one thing, and you can easily say, I'm stressed. It's so easy just to say, I'm stressed because you're feeling uptight, okay? But are you actually stressed? What is stress really? Stress is about the things that you don't know, okay? It's a response to worry and pressure, and it's more about external things that are happening in your life. Not necessarily, but it is mainly these kind of behaviors. Now, if we move on to anxiety, anxiety is about things that you do know. So you are concerned, worried, or very anxious about something because you've witnessed that happening before and you're worried it's going to happen again. Or you have an understanding of what could happen, and now you're thinking it's an excessive reaction, and you can become internal and external behavior. You just change completely because you're so anxious about what could happen. Then we move into trauma, and trauma are the things that have happened to you. So once again, the fight, flight, and freeze reaction comes into play, and you're reliving an experience, maybe mentally and physically. So remember, the brain will tap into resources to protect you and serve you, especially as you are designed to be. And the subconscious has alternative options. So the subconscious gives you your extra information that add to your trauma because it's telling you all the sorts of other things that could be there. There are signs that can help you distinguish between anxiety and stress. And there's a very fine line between both, as all the three, the stress, the anxiety, and the trauma, have very overlapping similarities. So it's not always easy. And sometimes we need professional help to be able to unpack all this. So while you cause yourself stress through negative talk and pessimistic sense of perfection, it is usually triggered by something external. That's stress. Too many responsibilities or high stakes have a stress result.
And like what you mentioned, anxiety is actually about the things that you do know, right? It could be both internal, external, but it's an excessive reaction to a situation itself. So it's more like an exaggerated and outsized reaction. If you actually feel more or beyond the reactions of other people, this could be an anxiety. In fact, it could be so much that it causes your daily life function to be affected. So it leaves you unable to manage your normal or daily life. Maybe you're so anxious, you're so distressed that you can't even leave your house. You can't even leave your bed, right? That you can't even work. And therefore, this leads to what we call the panic attack itself. So the anxiety that we feel causes that feelings of dread, right? For things that may not have yet happened or don't even exist, right? So this is very different from what Avra mentioned. Stress, something that is happening, something, the pressure that you actually feel. Anxiety, on the other hand, could be something that doesn't even exist in reality, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes. And for trauma, like what you mentioned in the brain diagram itself, it could be something that you feel, but when translated through the brain, it comes out to be something physical that you feel.
Yes. Very much so.
So in terms of elevated anxiety, I know some people have anxiety levels, some people have elevated anxiety. That really translates to some kind of specific symptoms. Avra, do you know anything about these symptoms?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you've got certain specific symptoms, these may be, for example, panic attacks, and a type of anxiety like social situations where you have anxiety in social areas where you don't feel comfortable with other people. That's called social anxiety. And, we have so much information about anxiety. But do we really understand it? And I had a real good think about it when I decided I wanted to talk about anxiety and trauma in this particular program. I don't believe that anxiety is an illness. I think it is a reaction in your nervous system. It's not necessarily something that you can't manage. So you've got a choice. You can decide, I need to go for help. I need to have medication. I need to unpack this. I need to work with a psychologist. I need to have a life coach. So when you have a disorder, it's more like something that's permanent. We can learn to manage our anxiety. Anxiety is something, it's a thought in our subconscious mind, and it's actually demanding attention to our focus. So what is the path of recovery? How do we see this? How do we get over this?
I really agree with you in that sense, where it's not an illness, it is something we manage. Because if it's an illness, we seek a cure or solution. But if it's something that we experience, we manage it, right? So we manage it with our path to recovery options. Maybe one of those could be reclaiming a sense of control over yourself. Because when you experience that anxiety and that, that trauma response, you just lose that sense of control. So if you want to try to reclaim that sense of control, you got to activate a connection to what you desire to happen at the end, which is what we call the outcome.
Correct.
When you're committed to feeling better, you find solutions to help yourself to feel better, right? To set an intention of what you wish to achieve. For example, when I'm anxious, I jump straight into the swimming pool because I need to swim. I need to get control of my thoughts. I need to let it flow, and then just feel like I'm in control.
I mean, but Yuka, you still have to address the problem. The problem.
That's right.
And what is the problem? Not how you're feeling. What scares you? What makes you afraid?
So it's not so much about just knowing how you feel, but what is causing your feeling, right?
Exactly. So what if
after knowing?
So what do you have to do? You have to put through change.
That's right. Yeah. A change from chaos to getting clarity at the end of the day so that you can find the peace within you and to make that change, that action plan to make yourself feel more secure.
Yes, yes. Or you could also look at reprogramming.
And what does reprogramming actually mean?
It's when you're actually feeling it in your body and you're in touch with your actual emotions and feelings, and you have an awareness. So for an example, if you are clenching your chin when you are in trauma, are you consciously aware of the fact that you are clenching your jaw?
That's true. That is true. That you have to be able to be very aware of that.
So awareness is very important. And the next very important part of reprogramming is about shame and blame factor.
Okay. So you need to remove the shame and the blame that you put on yourself too. So that you don't feel that way and react from that.
So back to address the problem. What is scaring you? What is making you feel like you should be shameful or be blaming yourself? Is there an external factor that caused that? Are you taking on a perspective that is not yours? Are you looking at different perspectives of why you're feeling the way you do? So that you have to reprogram, access your subconscious and start looking at it from different perspectives.
Every time we reprogram something, we create a new identity. So I think at the end of the day, we create a new post-traumatic identity, isn't it? Like after knowing how we feel, what we want to do about it, what scares us, and then implementing a change, we create something new, the new us. How do we want to feel in the new us, right?
Yeah.
What would life be without this trauma response in our life?
Yes. Then maybe we should ask ourselves the question, what would life be without this trauma that I'm experiencing?
Yes. How would the new Avra and the new Yuko be if we didn't have this trauma response?
Who would I want to be? So you're creating a new identity. You're saying, I'm living in this space. I'm scared. I need change. I need to reprogram. So let me be the person who I really am. Let me have a post-traumatic identity. Let me decide who I want to become. Relinquishing the fear by sitting with it, allowing it. Yeah. And this is so important because when we keep on resisting something, it persists. So if we keep on fighting and experiencing this trauma and saying, stop, 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 the more it's going to hit you, the more it's going to come at you.
Yeah, that really goes with there's this story about If I tell you not to think of a pink elephant with blue spots, you
No,
think of a pink elephant with blue spots first, and then you tell yourself not to think about it. That's reinforcing it, after all.
I can tell you about that pink elephant with blue spots over and over again.
In order to not tell me about it, you have to
In
tell me
order to
about
not
it
tell
first.
you about it, and you can't forget it.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's so much information that we are really digesting today. I'm feeling completely not anxious right now. I'm feeling very excited. In fact, I hope this would be the new me if my life is without trauma. The smiley emoticon everywhere I go.
So, is it not important for us to then, Yuka, have tools in our toolbox that we can help ourselves identify with trauma? And
I think,
one of those tools would be understanding denial. I'm okay, I'm fine, I'm coping, but actually I'm not.
yeah, yeah.
And that's one of your biggest tools in trauma.
Being aware and being able to admit that it's another step up, and knowing that not all trauma actually comes from our own intention.
Now, there's other areas of trauma as well that I think is very important for us to discuss about, and that is about seeking help.
Okay,
So,
seeking help.
yes, actually reaching out and seeking help.
Sounds like a great topic for the next session that we have there.
Oh, absolutely. My point I'm making is that if we don't seek help, how we are in trauma will continue.
Mm-hmm.
So, what would my message be for the day? I think not all trauma originates with your own intent. So trauma may be not about the mistakes that you've made or lessons that you are repeating. We can also be the victim of a circumstance beyond our control, an external event or an incident.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't take that on ourselves. We have to identify what we are in control of is the only thing we can be in control of. These kinds of trauma need space to find understanding, how to manage, and how to cope. We will need to continue with these tools to heal. And this is when our pain can turn into ownership and give us power to feel in charge of ourselves. So instead of living our lives trying continuously to eliminate the troubles and challenges, we need to find growth in this living with the trauma. So we sit with it and we give ourselves a new perspective and a solution to prevent continual feelings of fear.
Wow, so much to take away for today's session itself. Knowing more about ourselves, knowing more about how do we manage and how do we actually first take the first step to, to admit and acknowledge that we do have stresses. Some of us may have anxiety within or not within our control, and we have trauma responses. There's always something that we can do about it, isn't it?
And that's why it's so important for us to know that we're not alone.
Exactly. So thank you for joining us today, in our talk and not being alone in this journey itself. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and also check out the description below to receive your message for the day.
And if you've got anything to add to our chat today, please go to the comments below. Love and light to you all till next time.
See you soon. Peace out.